Hi, this is Julie, and welcome to Throwback Thursday. In honor of Mother's Quest turning 5, this season 7 of the podcast will bring episodes to you every Thursday. In addition to new episodes, we'll also share some powerful conversations from the archives. Keep in mind while listening that you may hear about some events or offerings that are no longer current. But whether you've heard this episode before or it's new to you, I hope you'll find something here as relevant as ever to light your way. This month in the Mother's Quest Facebook group, we're focused on the big transitions underway for our children and ourselves during this back-to-school season. To join the group and the conversation, visit mothersquest.com/community. This topic feels especially important for me this year because in just 1 week, we pack up our car to drive our son Ryan to LA to start his college freshman experience. As the day gets closer, we find ourselves savoring the moments, creating extra quality family time, and making space for conversations about all the things that matter. I found myself returning to the messages and inspiration of this conversation with best-selling author of Boys and Sex, Peggy Orenstein, and I thought you might need it too. Whether you have a boy just entering adolescence or off to college, I hope this episode provides perspective and support to open and continue having honest conversations to help your sons navigate the terrain of young male sexuality in today's world. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to 2 high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? Have you ever had a pinch me moment when you can't believe how things come together? With 2 boys in my home and 1 a teen already, I've wanted to interview New York Times bestselling author Peggy Orenstein for the Mother's Quest podcast since the moment I first heard about her new book, Boys and Sex. So when Jill Daniel of Happy Women Dinners asked me if I'd like to co-produce a dinner and conversation with Peggy in the San Francisco Bay Area, I said yes practically before she finished her sentence. That I would have the opportunity to interview Peggy for the debut episode of the Mother's Quest podcast season 5 ahead of our in-person dinner was just the most incredible bonus because Peggy's work is truly transformational. She's a New York Times bestselling author of Girls and Sex, Cinderella Ate My Daughter, Waiting for Daisy, Flux, and Schoolgirls, an award-winning journalist and internationally recognized speaker on gender issues, especially those related to teens, sex, and relationships, and a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. She's also been published in the Washington Post, Slate, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, and has been featured on Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, The Today Show, Morning Joe, my mother's favorite morning show, NPR's Fresh Air, and the PBS NewsHour. Her TED Talk, What Young Women Believe About Their Own Sexual Pleasure, has been viewed over 4.6 million times. Before I tell you about some of my takeaways from this conversation, I want to introduce my friend Casey O'Rourke of Joyful Courage for this episode's dedication.
Hey there, Mother Quest community. I am Casey O'Rourke, host of Joyful Courage, a conscious parenting podcast. I'm super excited to show up here and honored to be doing the dedication for the interview with Peggy Orenstein. I am so inspired by her work and research around sex and our girls and boys. And as the mother of a 14-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, her work is super real and relevant to me. I would like to dedicate this show to another favorite mama that I have who is doing similar work through her company, Birds and Bees and Kids, and that is Amy Lang. She inspires me in so many ways, both as a friend as well as a sex educator for parents. Like Peggy, Amy works tirelessly to support parents in having the hard conversations with their kids. She has been on my speed dial for years and talked me off the parenting ledge more times than I can count. Both of these women have inspired me to create a mini summit for parents of teens this April, focused all around sex, sexuality, and relationships. Parents have got to be available to their kids for talks around consent and porn and sexuality and codependency. We can't sit back and wait for them to come to us. I'm hoping that my summit will empower parents to get ever better at having those uncomfortable discussions, at being sex positive, and at setting the boundaries that are appropriate and useful for our kids. I'm interviewing 5 experts, including Amy Lang, who really know their stuff to be in conversation with me and answer questions that come straight from the Joyful Courage community. I would love to invite all of you to check that out in April. Thanks.
Thank you, Casey, for this inspiring dedication to Amy Lang. I'm so happy to know about her work in supporting parents and having conversations about sex, and to know about your upcoming mini summit. We'll include links in the show notes to both of your work, and I encourage everyone to go and check them out. The need to engage in conversations with our children about sex, even when they make us feel uncomfortable, was one of the biggest takeaways I had from my interview with Peggy. In this episode, we explore the insights she uncovered through her interviews with 100 teen boys and young men about their conceptions of masculinity and sexuality, including the early and pervasive experiences they have with porn, their understanding of consent, and the ways in which they feel unable to fully express themselves as emotional human beings. Where Peggy's prior research revealed that girls are systematically disconnected from their bodies, boys, she found, are disconnected from their hearts. As you listen, I invite you to think about how you could use something you learn in this episode to connect with your child. Be aware that while we don't have explicit conversations about sex, we do mention topics such as porn. Please use your discretion in whether you want to play this episode around your children. With older boys, you may purposefully choose, as Peggy jokingly suggests, to play this episode in their vicinity as a conversation starter. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this interview with you. I appreciated Peggy's openness to sharing about her own epic life, to her bravery in her work, her inclusion of the perspectives of transgender and gay boys, and to the impact of race in our conceptions of sexuality, and her challenge to us to have conversations with our children about sex. It's not just one talk, she says, but a series of ongoing ones that our times call for today. And we have to start somewhere. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. Peggy, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. It is such an honor to have you here in what is really part 1 of 2 epic experiences for me to connect with you. This first on the podcast, and then coming up in March live at a dinner, Happy Women dinner, that you will be coming to and sharing about your work. So this is just such a joy and a pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're going to have some time at the end of this interview for acknowledgements, but I cannot hold this acknowledgement until then. So I need to start with it, which is that I read your Atlantic Monthly article and was so struck by it, and just how much I felt like it gave me a window. And then, of course, the book goes into so much more depth, but the article was such a great summary. Gave me such a window into what my son, I have 2 boys, but my older one is starting to navigate the terrain that you cover in Boys and Sex. I felt like I had such a window into what he's really having to navigate. And I gave it to him, and he read it, said the same thing to me, that he felt so fully seen by what you wrote, and that it just was so validating that you were able to capture what a challenge it is.
That is the nicest thing you could possibly say. I mean, I feel like it's such a gift when somebody tells me that their son, or when a boy himself tells me that they felt really seen in this work, because I wanted that so much.
So thank you. We will start there. But then I want to go to the question that I ask every guest at the beginning of a conversation, which is, tell me a little bit about your childhood and the impact that your own mother has had in shaping who you are and what you're doing in the world today.
Well, it's actually a really serendipitous time to be having this discussion because actually the Jewish anniversary of my mother's death is today. So it's been 4 years since she died. During that time, I've thought a lot about her impact on me because my mom was a very different kind of a person than I am in a lot of ways. She had a very 1950s housewife mentality. She was not a feminist by any stretch of the imagination. She did not have many goals for me in the public sphere, any goals for me in the public sphere at all. So in a lot of ways, I came from a very conventional, traditional home, but she also was very interested in health, very interested in environmentalism, even in the 60s, she was always really into Rachel Carson. And she also was really positive about sex and kind of more open. I mean, I really have that experience. So I know what it's like as a kid of having a parent who's more open than you wish they would be. And while on one hand, my parents were super, super clear that this is not something that should be happening until you are married, which they dropped by the time I was about 18. But they also, my mom was always telling me that she and my dad had a really great sex life and she really enjoyed it. And they left books like Everything You Wanted to Know About Sex in the room where I did my homework, very visibly. And I would, say, Mom, don't, and plug my ears and run out of the room. But I really felt that despite that sort of ick factor of your parents having sex, I very much got from her a sense that sex was something that was really positive for women and girls, that it was something that you could communicate with a partner, that it was something that happened in a loving, trusting relationship, that it was pleasurable. So all of that was really important. And then even many years later, after I was married and an adult, I was in her condo, I guess then, and she came up to me and she kind of nudged me in the ribs and said, doesn't stop after you're 70, And again, I was like, ew, thank you. Ew, really good to know. I've thought about that a lot. It's a really important thing to tell somebody and ick. So I understand both the horror of talking to your parents or maybe your kids about sex, but also the value of even those kind of small conversations.
Wow. I'm really struck by that. And I'm thinking also about the ways in which we carry our ancestors with us in our work, even when they're not with us. And I'm curious whether you felt your mom's presence at all as you began this endeavor of talking about girls and sex and boys and sex.
So she died just about 2 months before Girls and Sex came out. I feel her with me every day. I talk to her every day, and particularly last night because I was lighting a candle. And then I did my big event in Berkeley. I kind of imagined what it would have been like for her to be there and wish she was there. And, I have her in my heart all the time. So I do spend a lot of time, and maybe more time than I would have if she were still alive, thinking about her influence on me and how much I am her daughter, even though for many years I felt sort of in conflict with her and a sense that kind of disappointment that she couldn't be a better guide for me in the kind of life that I live, because we had that kind of generational divide of her having never worked outside the home and being, very much in that kind of domestic sphere her whole life and not really understanding who I was or what I wanted from my life. I think in far deeper ways that I didn't recognize when I was younger. I'm absolutely her daughter, and she absolutely transmitted values and ideas that are foundational to who I am and what I do and what I believe.
Yeah. And how did your childhood and what came after connect you to the path that you're on now as a writer and a writer who takes on such challenging topics?
I always wanted to be a journalist. I mean, since I was in 10th grade and I took first quarter of 10th grade, I took a journalism class kind of on a whim, I think, and just locked in. I just thought this is what I want to do with my life. So I never really changed in that regard. Because of when I grew up, there was a lot of foment around change in women's lives and in girls' lives. And I always think back on one story in particular that I did when I was in high school, where my school counselor, who was like the female equivalent of that Ben Stein character in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, she was really square, right? But she, for some reason, I don't know why, asked me if I would do a school newspaper article, a teen mother in my school. Not only did I not know there were teen mothers in my school, but again, because I grew up with a very strict idea of sex as something that happens after marriage, I had no idea people were having sex in my school. And I went to one of the, my school had like 2,100 kids in 10th or in 3 grades. So it was a big school. and economically very diverse. And so we met in a classroom and I interviewed her and she told me she had a 2-year-old. She told me all about her life and how hard it was and how she didn't get to go out with her friends. And she went from school, to work, to taking care of her daughter. And we had this whole conversation. And then as she left, she stopped at the door and turned to me and said, if you see me in the hall, don't say hello to me, because there's no way somebody like you would know somebody like me. And I don't want anybody asking any questions.
Wow.
And then she disappeared into the hallway. And I sat there and I don't think when I was 17 or 16, whatever I was, I had the wherewithal to quite put this thought together. But I think it was a moment of recognition for me about how these opportunities of girlhood and this new world were different, depending on what family you were born into or whether you had crossed these lines of taboo, whether you were mothering, what race you were, all these different questions. And I think that I started kind of the inkling of what would become my sort of guiding philosophy, which was that any individual story can tell us something universal about the time in which we live. And so I felt that the stories of these two girls, of me and of her, just said something much larger than I think whatever that counselor intended when she put us in that room, which was probably a warning story about, not having sex and not getting pregnant. But I don't know. At any rate, that is a really foundational story for me. And I don't remember that girl's name. I don't really remember what she looked like. I don't know what happened to her, but I've never forgotten her.
I always talk about how experiences in our life really plant seeds for what's to come in ways that we may not know for a really long time. And that sounds like one of those transformational seed planting stories for you.
Yeah.
And would you say that that is what you are most on a quest for in your life? To take individual stories and help them make meaning for what that means in our time?
Yes. And largely, until this last book, Until Boys Had Sex, although I still think that this is in many ways about girls and women, it's been about applying that philosophy to what I think is one of the biggest stories of our time, which is the changes in the lives of women and girls. I feel like I was born into and live, of course, obviously as a woman, one of the most profound, meaningful stories that we've ever had as people. So taking that lens of what do our stories tell us, looking at a really important aspect of our history and our politics right now through those individuals. I think you can tell a story a lot of ways, right? Some people are drawn to telling stories through the story of power. They like to talk about politics, or they like to talk about presidency or whatever. You can tell it through business. You can tell it through so many different lenses. But for me, I think the really exciting and engaging and perpetually interesting way to tell a story is through just talking to ordinary people.
Well, I want to now talk more about you and your life using what I have called the E.P.I.C framework. So when I started Mother's Quest, which was just over 3 years ago now, it was because I felt like I was ready to reclaim my life in many ways after a decade of losing some parts of myself in motherhood. And I also was on a quest to make an impact in the world. This was around the same time that Trump was elected. And I felt that I was called upon to step beyond just my family and make more of an impact. So E.P.I.C connotes this idea of being the author of my story and filling my life with the experiences and the impact that matters most. It also is an acronym mnemonic for the guideposts that I think help us to live that life when we're raising our children. And I've found these guideposts are not only really helpful for me in thinking about how to set intentions in my life, but become a really powerful way to engage in deep and meaningful conversation with my guests on the podcast. So I'm going to ask you about these guideposts, and we may spend some more time on some rather than others. And we'll look at them through the lens of your current work right now at Boys and Sex. Let me start with the first guidepost, E, and that stands for engaged mindfully with our children. What can you begin to tell us about the ways in which we can mindfully engage with our boys or our daughters about sex?
First of all, it's recognizing that sex isn't just about sex. We tend to put sex in a silo over to the side as if sex doesn't connect to all the other aspects of who we are as people, as if it's not about being a good and caring and decent and compassionate and connected human being when all of that is of a piece. In engaging, particularly with our boys, yes, it's about sex. Yes, it's about accountability. Yes, it's about consent, but it's also about connection. And one of the things that was really clear in talking to boys in particular, what I tend to say when I talk about these two books side by side is that the girl book was a lot about the ways that girls are systematically disconnected from their bodies and from their wants and their desires and their limits. And the boy book is about, even more than sex, how boys are systematically disconnected from their hearts and the impact of that. And so many of the boys would talk to me about, they would say they had to build a wall between them and their feelings. And what they were allowed was happiness and anger, but everything else had to go behind that wall. And certainly one of the things that went behind that wall in a big way was any sign of vulnerability. And when we don't allow for vulnerability, not only is that a fundamental human trait, but Brene Brown says it's the secret sauce that holds relationships together. So when we deny boys the capacity or the ability to access, actually a therapist recently said I should say emotional accessibility instead of vulnerability because it's less scary to men, but whatever. When we deny them their capacity for that, we deny them the ability to have the kind of mutually gratifying, meaningful relationships that we want for them. And that hurts them and that hurts their romantic partners. So in a lot of ways, ground zero with boys, even before you get to what is sex, how do we define it, what's female pleasure, what's accountability, what's consent, all these things, is helping them stay connected to their emotional selves. And, if you have little boys, that means expanding their emotional vocabulary, naming their emotions, saying, seems like you're sad, or it seems like you're frustrated, instead of always defaulting to them being angry. And with older boys too, having these conversations where that helps them name, recognize, and process their emotions. Because I think that that's one of the main things that is lost for boys along the way. And that then feeds into all these messages that they get that their sexual selves should be disconnected and that they should treat partners as disposable.
Yeah. So I also have a 7-year-old, so I'm really valuing, how this would show up differently developmentally for both of my boys. I'm also thinking about, and I'll link to this in the show notes, a conversation that I had with Lad Everett, who is a gun safety advocate. And we were talking about, what's happening with all of the gun violence and the connection between gun violence and toxic masculinity. The number one piece of advice he gave to me as a parent is to create space and allow my boys to cry.
Yeah, right.
All his experience, that's what he felt like was ground zero.
That is so deep and so true. It took me a while, and I talk about this in the book, to be able to hear what boys were saying about the taboo against crying. Because as a woman, I'm like, they would say, and I cried about that. Like they had just told me, I don't know, like they'd stripped themselves naked and through the center of town or something. And I would think, okay, you cried. Right. Yeah. That seems like something a person would cry about. And it took me time to see how big that was. And even when they would tear up in front of me, how big that was. And they would say, like one boy said to me, when his parents divorced, he wanted to cry. But as he said, I had trained myself not to. So he couldn't. So what he did was stream 3 movies about the Holocaust back to back. And that worked. But like that was what it took in order. Yeah, that was how he had to do it, to be able to connect to himself. And what does that say about your basic humanity and what we've done to young men and how they take that forward and what that means about them in relationship to their romantic partners.
And then what kind of parents and fathers they become and what they then want for their children.
In the research, it shows that guys say that the source of their most restrictive ideas about masculinity are their parents, and especially their fathers. And what I heard from boys was, yes, some of them would say, my dad said, man up. My dad said, don't be a little bitch, whatever. But most of them said that was not the case. Most of them said things like, there was a boy in Los Angeles who said, my dad wasn't, sexist. He wasn't homophobic. I didn't learn that toxic masculinity idea from him. But he said, I did learn the stunted side of masculinity. He was not someone who'd talk about emotions. He was more of a sigh and walk away kind of a guy, the kind of guy who would ask you what was going on. And from him, I learned not to have any of these conversations.
Wow.
And I think that's much more common. I think that hits home for a lot of families and for a lot of men.
That makes a lot of sense. And almost like a default statement that parents are probably not even consciously making. I have a Mother's Quest Facebook community, and I posted last night about this interview and what were people's most pressing questions. And there were quite a number of questions about when and how to talk to our boys about porn, and also, when and how to teach about consent. Mm-hmm. But before I get into that, I don't want to forget that even as I asked you this question about how do we talk to our daughters and sons about sex, I immediately realized that I'm holding, gender binary in that question.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious about how, I know you must have thought about young people that are gender nonconforming.
Yes.
And just how you're holding that amid this very specific research that you did.
Yeah, I do write about both people who are gender nonconforming and also people who engage in gay boys or people who engage in sexual contacts with people with the same genitals that they have. And one of the things that was really interesting in talking particularly to trans boys, I mean, on one hand, they were really clear that it's not their job. They are not angels sent down from heaven to change masculinity. They're just trying to be themselves. And that said, there were a lot of interesting lessons to be learned from those boys and also from their impact on male enclaves when they were in them, and very positive lessons. And I think a lot about one boy in particular who would talk to me about masculinity, and he would make these kind of side comments all the time where he would say, well, that's not my masculinity. Or, yeah, that's my masculinity. I realized that was my masculinity, but that's not my, and I thought, wow, I never heard a cis straight boy say that. I never heard a cis gay boy say that, where they looked at like masculinity like this thing that they could assemble for themselves and make decisions about. Yeah, construct. And he had a really deep, and I don't even know if he knew he was doing that. I don't know if that was a conscious thing that he was saying, but it was fascinating to just have that shift a little bit in my head. And I actually didn't even realize it until after the book was done. So I don't even comment it on the book. But I wish I did.
Here.
Yeah, because there's always things you learn after, right? There's always things that you think, oh, bring the book back so I can put that in. And that was one of them. Just like the fact that he had to think about masculinity more consciously meant that he constructed it and how he built something positive for himself within that. And also how he did take it upon himself, which again, not all trans or non-binary people do, to challenge some of his friends, particularly his teammates on his sports team, their ideas and practices as cis straight men, not because they should think that they were something other than that, but just to say, is that the masculinity you want? Do you want that masculinity where you are making really offensive jokes about women to one another? How is that serving you? So it was
I'm feeling myself wanting to know, like, what actually is the definition of masculinity?
Well, right? It's, I suppose, whatever you want it to be, right? What's your definition of femininity? I don't know. You know, there's like how the boys think about it. There's how the culture thinks about it. There's what we assign to it. The thing about the boys was that while on one hand, I made a typo in something I was writing to a friend where I meant to say the difference between their public and private life, but I actually said their public and pubic life. And I thought, that's actually correct. Because in the public sphere, boys, of course, things had changed. They saw girls as deserving of their place in the classroom, leadership, educational and professional opportunities. They had female friends, gay male friends. But if you talk to them, what made the ideal guy, which was a sort of a more, particularly back into the private life more, there was wealth, dominance, aggression. It was like 1955. They would say sexual conquest was a sure route to status, bragging about your sexual conquest, and emotional suppression, which we've already talked about. In some ways, that wasn't so surprising because when I talked to girls, they too were struggling with the new expectations and the more modern, ideas that they had taken on, and the ways that they hadn't let go of old assumptions and ideals about what it meant to be female or feminine. One of the things that I talk about in Girls and Sex is the ways that sex and gender are mediated by race and ethnicity. And there was a case in the book where some of the African-American boys that I was talking to, there were 2 boys that were suspended from their school, 2 African-American boys, for sexual And so we have a long discussion about the ways that they carry intergenerational trauma around that, and the ways that false accusations of assault have been used as a tool of social control of Black men, but that actual rape has been used as a tool of social control for all women, and how those things can sometimes come into conflict, those ideas, and make it difficult for us to hear and understand one another. And I kind of try to tease some of that apart in the book.
Yeah. And that's the chapter. Is it titled
Heads I Win, Tails You Lose? Because it's particularly about African American and Asian American boys and the ways that they are sort of flip sides of a coin, where white masculinity is controlling the toss because white masculinity is the neutral, and African American boys felt that hypersexuality was projected onto them, which could make them either the coolest guy in the room or the most predatory guy in the room, depending on who was doing the looking. And Asian American boys felt that asexuality and emasculation were projected onto them, and that had its own kind of set of psychological stress. So looking at kind of the two sides of that.
So important that you really approach the research from all of these different important perspectives, and you're shining a light on all of it.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about porn. I'm still reading the book. I'm in the porn chapter. I mean, I just if you could have a mirror to see my expression of just the horror and the worry of what is going on. What do you feel is most important for us to know as parents? And what are the things we can do? When do we start talking about porn? How should we start talking about it? How should we handle what our kids have such easy access to right now?
Well, that, is a whole hour unto itself for sure. And I would say what I would suggest in terms of resources is checking out my website, which is peggyorenstein.com, because, depends on the age and all this stuff. And there's some resources on porn. Also, if you have a younger child who's more like middle school age, there's a website called amaze.org that has really filled in the gap in sex education for middle schoolers and has these great videos, including discussions of porn. So it's already there for you. So I will just throw that out right now. Okay, so there's that. So that's the good news about this. And also understanding when you're talking to your child that curiosity about sex is normal, masturbation is normal. What has changed is that, yes, the smartphone, yes, the internet. It used to be that the hardcore porn was behind a paywall, and that dropped when Pornhub went online in 2007. And I do say to parents, particularly mothers who may not have looked, and if you're into that, that's your affair, you're an adult, but you should go look at Pornhub just so you know if you've got some because if you've got some kind of 1970s or 1980s idea of porn in your head, you're so far off that you don't really know what we're talking about here. And what that kind of easy access porn tells kids over and over is that sex is something that men do to, not with women, that female pleasure, really wildly distorted, is a performance for male satisfaction. Bodies are distorted. There's no consent. There's no sensuality. There's no playfulness. I mean, there's so many things not there. And what's happened is that when parents aren't talking about it, when schools aren't talking about it, porn is becoming the de facto sex educator for this generation of kids. So we really need to get in there and tell them what's real, what's not real, what's missing. Because even when they say they know the difference, they don't really. And what the research shows is that guys who are regular porn consumers actually are more likely to believe its images are real and more likely to want to act out some of its behaviors in the bedroom. So we really do have to talk to our kids. We don't have the luxury anymore of silence. And I also think it is reasonable to talk to your schools about, what kind of media education are they doing? What kind of tech safety education, digital citizenry education are they doing? And how are they integrating this into it? Because there's the whole issue of seeking out, which happens at puberty. I never asked a boy whether he watched porn. I asked when he started, because it would have shot my credibility to hell. But also, kids much younger may have things sent to them or shown to them that they don't really want to see and don't know how to handle. So that's, the piece about talking earlier is you may get something, somebody sends somebody to you, and that is wrong. It's inappropriate. It's not real. And it's not consensual to have you receive that or for you to pass it on.
What age should we start talking to our kids about porn?
Well, like I said, I think amaze.org does a really good job of addressing that conversation in more of the kind of middle school, maybe 5th, 6th grade. And I think that that's a great time to start having that conversation. But if you're having conversations with your child about what consent is, what sex is, what friendship is, what, the way that we treat each other with dignity means, you can, in the course of those conversations, maybe when they're a little bit younger, maybe I'd say around 10, 9, 10, maybe, or whenever they get a smartphone, I guess, for sure. Say, just like there's content that's extreme and violent, there's content that's extreme and sexual and is upsetting. If you see that, you need to tell me and we need to talk about it. And you may not ever send that to anybody. And it is not reflecting our values about human dignity or friendship or how we treat people or sexuality. And it's not real.
What would you say are your biggest words of wisdom about how to talk to our boys about consent?
Well, it depends, obviously on the age of the child. I can't give you one word of wisdom, but if you are talking to little kids, you can teach lessons of consent from the get-go, right? You can tell your child you don't hug somebody unless they give you permission, and somebody needs permission to hug you too. You can say that, can I hug you, to your own child if you want to. Mm-hmm. Certainly if, Great Aunt Nancy comes over and wants to give your son a kiss and he doesn't want to kiss Great Aunt Nancy's just got to suck it up. You don't make your kid kiss the relative anymore. We don't say you have to respect your relative and kiss them. That is not true. You respect bodily integrity and somebody saying no. That's a really important lesson in consent. So those sorts of things, again, it's about sex, but it's not about sex at all. It's about basic human dignity and the way that we treat one another. As kids get older, you can have more complicated conversations with them. And I think it's really clear in the research on college campuses that understanding consent does not necessarily reduce rates of sexual assault on college campus, unfortunately. And I think that's because of these socialization ideas with boys that make it impossible for them to believe that the thing that they did violated consent. And what's coming out in research, there's some research from University of Michigan that's really interesting on this, is that when boys' actions don't meet their definition of consent, they expand their definition rather than examine their actions. So we have to really not only reinforce what consent is, what consent isn't, which I'm really clear about in the book. And Planned Parenthood actually has a great graphic on this called fries, like French fries. That's really wonderful. But also making visible the gender dynamics that might get in the way of recognizing when you have crossed those boundaries. And what happens when we do cross those boundaries? What can we do to make amends? What can we do to take accountability? How will we hold our kids responsible for that?
For sure, we're linking to the book and encouraging everybody to get it. And I know that you go into more depth about all of these issues. I want to move to the next guidepost, and we'll probably have to move through these guideposts in a little bit more of kind of lightning round fashion.
Yeah.
P stands for passionate and purposeful impact beyond your family. What do you hope to be the biggest change and impact that you can make in your work with this?
Well, I want to change everything. My long game is that I want young people to be able to have mutually gratifying, personally fulfilling relationships that are equitable, that are pleasurable, that are respectful, that are joyous, that are all those things, and that are egalitarian. And so everything that I do with both boys and with girls is toward that end.
Yes. I'm saying yes to that as my long game goal for my children as well. I stands for invested in ourselves. And this is where the kind of self-care, commitment to our own growth and learning, filling our own lives with joy comes in. What I found myself being curious about as I was reading the book was wanting to hear from you how you have cared for yourself as you've been having these intense conversations, as you've been taking this work out into the world. I imagine that it's not always met with support. What can you tell us about the ways that you have cared for yourself during this?
Well, obviously staying connected to family and friends is really important. I feel that I need constant, grounding, like to touch base. My husband, I always think of him as sort of, my home base, that I just have to like physically touch him and just, feel that I am me. It pulls me back into myself to be with him. I'm also a big yoga person. I'm a meditator. So taking those things on the road with me is super important. It's so exciting for me to be able to put this work into the world and to be able to feel that I have an impact, that even though, I mean, yes, there's some really ugly social media stuff and all of that, it's inevitable. But what could be hard about the work going on was that I did hear a lot of stories of trauma from both boys and from girls. And that is hard to bear witness to. And sometimes, you know, I would go back if I was on the road talking to kids. I'd be in a hotel and I would just be like, you know, staring into space. But knowing that I could have an impact to help change that was maybe the best way for me to work through that and move through that and move through what it means to bear witness to that.
The last guidepost, C, stands for connected. Is about the relationships in our lives and realizing that we don't have to move through this journey, this epic life journey on our own, but we can really do it in community. You've already started to allude to that about where you find community and the support of your husband and family and friends. Anything else that has been important to you about community? And then I've also been curious about any wisdom you have to share for other parents as we say yes to navigating this terrain about where we might find support.
Well, I think with other parents, talking to one another is so crucial, and having kind of a community of values that you are transmitting together to your kids. I mean, I know that I'm a parent of a teenager, and as much as I can, and it gets much harder as they get older, know the parents of her friends, sort of back channel together, texting each other like, you know, what are they doing tonight? What do we think about that? How is this going with them? You know, it's much harder to do as kids move into a bigger world, but they still really need our support in that way, and talking about how we're all talking about these issues with our kids, how we feel, you know, about substances, how we feel about sex, how we feel about them being in somebody's house without parents there, you know, all these different issues that just are constantly coming at you. It's really hard to navigate those alone. You really need to do that in community. I feel like I have found a lot of community in that space. I have kind of a funny relationship to community, I guess, because I grew up in a really insular community. My husband jokes that I grew up like an Amish person, and it was important to me to break free from that in order to become myself. So I can get a little uncomfortable if I feel like my community is too closed. I need a lot of personal freedom in my relationships and in my life to feel sort of safe and comfortable.
As you were just talking about staying connected to other parents, I was thinking of actually a recent Happy Women Dinners event I went to with Lisa Heffernan, the co-author of Grown and Flown. And she was talking about how, you know, as our children get into high school and beyond, and these issues become more complex, actually parents are less connected to one another. You know, we're not doing the drop-offs. And
it's so true.
So just thinking about, you know, what are the other ways? And, you know, sometimes it is a Facebook group like Grown and Flown, or just what you said, literally picking up the phone and making that effort to make those connections.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like it's become more and more important to, and also not just with peer group of your child's parents, but I have friends who have children who are a few years younger than my daughter or a few years older, and being able to talk to them about either, you know, what I've learned for the ones who have younger kids or what I need to know with the ones who have older kids. That's super important and really gives perspective. So I think any way that we can connect. I mean, my child went from a very small private school into an enormous public school where she knew basically no one. And I think that was very upending for her. And it was very upending for us as a family to have to try to reconfigure that sense of community and knowing and having a little bit, you know, less of a much longer leash, yes, but also a bit of a safety net because they're impulsive and they're going into a world where they're making some really crucial decisions around their well-being at that age.
So we are, sadly for me, towards the end of our conversation. We're at the point where I want to invite you to give me a challenge that will help me more fully live my epic life, more fully be able to parent my children through this terrain of consent and relationships and sex and connection and emotion. And as always, anybody listening can say yes to this challenge as well. So what would you like to challenge me to?
You know, I think that the biggest lesson of both Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex as books is we have to talk to our children, and you need to start somewhere. Just start somewhere today and have just a little conversation, even if it's just saying, you know, I did this podcast today and we were talking about these issues and this particular one struck me and I'm wondering what that's like in your life.
So great. So the commitment would be then that I and we say yes to at least one conversation and maybe building from something we heard you share with us now.
Yeah. Or just, play the podcast while your child is in the room and try to start the conversation that way. Or in the car. I'm a very big advocate of doing it in the car because, although don't let them listen to this part, because they are trapped and they can't get away and you don't have to make eye contact. It's perfect.
I love that. Well, a commitment that I want to make and something that I really heard in your book and in your interviews, while I really honor the start somewhere and start with just one, I really heard that we need to commit to conversations over to multiple conversations. So,
multiple conversations over time. Absolutely. It's not a talk. And yet also you have to start somewhere.
Start somewhere. Yeah. So we can hold both of those truths. And I commit to doing that. And I will continue to share in my own Mother's Quest community if anything comes up that I can, while protecting my children's privacy about those conversations. Thank you so much. I always like to end with acknowledgements and takeaways. So we each get a chance to share anything that we're appreciating about what we explored together or that we're leaving this conversation with. I want to start by saying I appreciate your bravery in your work, the larger frame that you hold for all of this, that really, even though you're, talking about sex, that it really is at the end of the day about our children's joy and emotional well-being and care and respect and ability to respect people's human dignity. I don't think we often talk about sex in that way. And I just think it's so crucial. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'm also grateful for your commitment to looking at multiple lenses, that you did talk to gay and trans boys, that you looked at the intersection around race. And I just think that that's so essential for any of these conversations that we have going forward. So I really value your work and commit to continue to follow and to learn and to be in conversation with me.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I really am grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk to you and have this conversation. It was really lovely and fun and thought-provoking.
What, if anything, may be coming into clearer focus for you after this conversation?
I think what was really unusual and fun about this conversation for me was having the chance to talk a little bit about my own childhood and formative stories and being able to think about my mom, especially today.
Yes. I'm so grateful that we were able to do that for you. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you live and in person on March 4th for our Happy Women dinner that Jill Daniels coordinating. And we'll definitely make sure to, whatever additional insights, and I'm sure there will be many that come from that experience, I will share in the show notes and with the community.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, visit mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and help us to spread the word. I want to end with some words to help light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.